to Toyota Time with Timmy the Toolman and Sean. Today we are on location in Stockton, California at Valley Hybrids. And if you've never heard of Valley Hybrids, they have been specializing in working on Toyota Land Cruisers for over 20 years. I'm here with Georg, who started this business from the ground up, starting in a 2-car garage to now in a very big facility in Stockton. What we're gonna show you how to do today is we're gonna do a custom rebuild on an 80 series Land Cruiser transfer case. So we're gonna be putting in lower gears so you can crawl better while you're four-wheeling. We're gonna put a high range under gear to where it's just like getting your differentials re-geared when you put bigger tires on. Instead of re-gearing your differentials, the modification that Georg is going to do to this is going to give you a better power range for all your driving needs. Also, we're going to do a part-time four-wheel drive modification to this transfer case. If you know about these vehicles, they are all-time four-wheel drive, so doing this mod will allow you to run in two-wheel drive, and then you'll have locking hubs to where you can put it in four-wheel drive and go have fun on the trails. I'm gonna get Georg in front of the camera so he can describe a little bit of history of his company and what exactly you're gonna see Georg doing today to this transfer case.
Hey guys, Georg from Valley Hybrids. Today is our first video with Tim the Toolman. We've been talking about this for months and excited to finally make it happen. If you haven't heard about Valley Hybrids, we are, as you can see, a Land Cruiser specific shop. This started as a hobby about 30 years ago, got into cruisers, and then 20 years ago decided I needed to change what I was doing for a living, and I thought it'd be a great idea to work on Land Cruisers. So pretty much started in a 2-car garage, and it's evolved. You know, this is the 4th iteration, I'd say, our 4th location, and every time we move, we get maxed out, but we're gonna keep it to this size. We've been around for about 20 years, and as I said, we do strictly mechanical work on Land Cruisers. It's anything from basic maintenance and repairs to upgrades like suspension, axle regearing, lots of transfer case work, all the way up to full conversions, LS swaps, diesel swaps. As long as it's a Land Cruiser, it's mechanical work, and we have done it before and are happy with the type of conversion we're doing and make sure our customers are happy, then we'll do it. Today's show is going to focus on what we refer to as a HF2A transfer case. This is an HF2AV. It's slightly longer because it's got a viscous coupler. Part of the modification on this is going to be that we're going to put a part-time kit in here that gets rid of the viscous coupler and allows us to run in rear-wheel drive and then select four-wheel drive. We're also going to run a lower high-range gear set to compensate for larger tires, so it brings the RPMs back down closer to the factory ratio when you're driving in high range and on the freeway, as well as a low-range gear set for better off-road capability and control. And it takes a lot of stress off the transmission, torque converter, keeps everything cooler, and just makes it easier for the operator to enjoy the truck when they're off-roading. These transfer cases were offered in the US in all the 80 series trucks, as well as the 100 series trucks, and the rest of the world, they were in some of the 70 series vehicles as well. So very popular case, very, very popular upgrade. The cases are extremely durable. There's not enough room in the 80 series to really do a doubler unless you do major, major modifications. So having a low range gear set or a lower gear set in low range makes a tremendous difference and requires no other modifications to the vehicle. The drive shaft stays the same, shifter stays the same, exhaust, cross member, everything stays the same. It's 100% bolt-in and doesn't affect the vehicle in any other way, requires nothing else. So it can be done in your garage without having to go to any other specialty shop.
Say if somebody doesn't live in California, close to the city of Stockton, can somebody ship their transfer case to you and get all these cool modifications done to their 80 series or 100 series transfer case?
It's a really good question, and we actually do a lot of that. We have customers all over the US, even up in Canada and other places, that get a hold of us and say, hey, you know, I want to do this. I'm not confident that I can do it. I don't trust my local shops. I don't have the tooling. I don't have a place to do it. I don't have the time to do it. I only have a carport, anything along those lines. We have a collection of cores for transmissions, transfer cases, what have you, differentials too. So when customers reach out to us, we can say, yes, we can build you a custom transfer case, whatever your needs are, and work with them to figure out what exactly they should be doing to their transfer case, which I consider part of our job is to make sure to provide proper guidance. And then we build a unit, we ship it out to them, and they ship us their old one as a core in exchange, so we don't just run out transfer cases or transmissions. But yes, absolutely.
Very cool. So you just heard it from George himself. You can send your transfer case from any city in the country and they can do this rebuild for you. So don't worry, you can get a cool rebuilt transfer case from George too, and you don't have to live in California to get it done.
And we do have a lot of customers that are local or semi-local. You know, sometimes they ship us the whole vehicle, sometimes they ship us just a transfer case, or they stop by and drop off a transfer case. You know, we have a lot of DIY guys that say, hey, you know what, I want to save the money on taking the transfer case out and putting it back in, or the transmission or diffs, and they just bring us the units. We call them bench work. Then we build them and they come back and pick them up, or we ship them out, or we have a rebuilt one ready to go. So they bring us their existing core, we give them the new one, and down the road they go, and they can do the install pretty much in a weekend. So that way, if you want to do this yourself and you're anywhere near us or want to ship it, you can literally get a rebuilt transfer case or transmission differential, whatever, from us, put it in on the weekend, take the old one out, and then drop the other one off. So it shortens the process of the repair and upgrade to literally being able to do it without having to take any time off work or worried about it starting one weekend and then trying to deal with stuff during the week and then continuing the next weekend and so on. So the vehicle downtime is minimized.
All right, so you heard it from the man himself, George. He obviously has a ton of experience with working on Land Cruisers, and you are in for a total treat here. It's not every day that we get to partner with an expert in the industry, and I really appreciate George willing to work with us so we can bring you this awesome tech. Provided you have the tools necessary, you should be able to perform this rebuild yourself if you choose to do it. After watching the video, you see that this is a little bit more involved than you want to get into, then you obviously know the company to send your transfer case to get this awesome modification done to your 80 series or 100 series transfer case. Without further ado, we are going to get started with this job and start tearing down this transfer case.
Okay, when we tear down these transfer cases, the first thing we do is get a good look at it. I typically take pictures of the units so I know where any of the electrical connectors go or little brackets, tiny little details like that. So anytime we get a unit in or I tear one apart, and this is a good idea for a layman to get into also, is document everything by taking pictures. It'll be much easier than trying to remember where everything goes. We do it for every unit that comes in because sometimes they come with shifters, sometimes they've been modified, there are different things bolted in different locations, so we do a lot of photographic documentation just to make sure that everything goes back together the way it came. The mechanical work of the transfer case, we've done literally hundreds of these. I can take one that's taken apart and been in pieces and assemble it, but I still like to ID everything properly. As mentioned, the first thing we do is take all the electrical components off so they're not damaged during the rebuild. You have 3 pressure switches on these cases, and you have an electric shift motor or a servo. So if you look at the switches carefully, the switch in the front as well as this switch, which are pretty much in line, use the same connector. Then the third switch uses a different style connector. So when they go back together, you have to get them back in this location. It doesn't matter if you switch these 2 around, they're identical. As long as you have 2 identical switches front and in line, and the other switch back here, the servo can only go on one way. So let's pop these off real quick. Takes a 27mm socket or wrench. Once you pop them loose, you can just unscrew them by hand. And there's no springs or check balls or anything behind them. That's all built into the switch. These, just like any of the drain plugs or fill plugs, take an aluminum crush washer. So when you go back together, make sure you install the crush washer.
You recommend replacing those crush washers, right?
Every time, absolutely. It's a one-time use deal. If you're on the trail and it's a trail repair, you can reuse them. If you're doing service work, replace the crush washers. They're less than $1 each. I typically make sure that every customer has a small Ziploc bag with a few extra crush washers in their vehicle when they leave here. So the servo is held down by 4 bolts, a long one, 3 shorter ones. They use a 12mm socket. You'll notice that over here, this is the harness for the shift servo, and typically this little fitting right here has a breather line that comes out of here, runs through this retaining clip right here, and then comes over and tees into the breather for the transfer case. For this particular transfer case, the breather line was removed and stayed in the vehicle. And again, going back to taking pictures and making sure everything gets put back where it is, this little bracket is retained on the back of the shift motor here by that bolt. So your wiring cannot get into the shift linkage or near the exhaust or any other possible issues. This connector, you have to be careful with them. They're 20 to 30 years old and they get brittle over time. So instead of trying to take it off the bracket, I typically just remove the bolt from the back of the transfer case and leave the bracket attached to the harness. That way it's also easier for me to figure out or remember that, hey, it just goes right on that bolt and you don't lose the bracket. That's a 14 millimeter bolt, or a 14 millimeter socket is required for the bolt, just like most of the bolts holding this transfer case together, which is one of the beauties of this transfer case. It doesn't require a lot of tools. They actually really work their way down from the earlier transfer cases used so many different tools and so many different size bolts and nuts and whatever, that these later ones, realistically, you only need 4 different sockets for this entire transfer case. So that stays attached. This is retained with 4 bolts, but there are also 2 sleeves underneath here to keep the servo perfectly aligned to the top of the transfer case. So if you just pry on it and go sideways, all you're gonna do is bend those sleeves and possibly crack the aluminum housing. So you need to lift up on it. The easiest way to do that, grab a pry bar, come in from underneath here, move the electrical out of the way, and then put pressure on the bottom of the little electric shift motor. And then wiggle it up and it comes right off. Here are the alignment sleeves. 2 of the bolts actually go through them. Sometimes they pop out. This one feels a little loose, pops out. Sometimes they stay in place. Don't lose these, you're gonna need them. The next step is to remove the gear that actually transfers power from the servo to one of the shift rails. And you'll notice that it goes back and forth about 90 degrees. And that engages and disengages either your front output or locks your CDL, your center diff. In this case, it will be the center diff. If we do the part-time kit, then it'll engage the front output. Sounds a little complicated. Once we rebuild the case, it'll be easier to understand. The gear just pulls straight up like that. There's no bearing or anything. It's just aluminum housings machined perfectly for this surface. There's not a lot of pressure on this gear and it hardly ever moves unless you press the CDL button. So pretty simple. The next thing we're going to remove is a set of 4 detent plugs. Actually, only one of them really has a detent spring and ball underneath there. The other ones are just utilized for access for machine work or to install dowel pins. We have one at the front output, then we have the one under the servo that has a spring and check ball. There's one just behind on the main case, and then there's one towards the back on the rear extension housing. These require a number 45 Torx bit. If you use a wrong bit, you're either gonna break your bit or you're gonna strip the bolts out. So make sure you use a 45. To get them out, put a little bit of pressure on it and then just pop it. And they should unscrew it. It'll have a little bit of pressure because from the factory, they install a type of sealer, almost like a thread locker. Usually you can see a little bit of green residue. It's hard to see on this one. Sometimes it's a little whitish. Same with differential studs and transfer case bolts and other things on Toyotas. This one, as mentioned, has a check ball under it. It's not going to come flying out of there, but it's a good idea to use a small magnet. Pull your spring out first, and then the check ball. And we have one more here. You can see the greenish residue from the factory sealer. And then one in the back of the case. The only one that really needs to be removed is the one with the check ball and spring, so they're not lost. The other plugs are merely access ports that are not used during assembly or disassembly. I like to take these plugs out, so when I run this case through the cleaning process, which would be a solvent tank and a parts washer, everything gets washed out of there. I don't want to leave any old oil in there or possible contamination or anything else. Okay, the next 2 items we're going to deal with is a speedo drive assembly and the oil pump pressure relief valve. So the relief valve takes a 10 millimeter Allen wrench. I use a snap-on T-handle. It also works on the Allen style drain and fill plugs. We use these a lot in the shop, so all my mechanics have one of these. These are usually pretty tight, so you have to give them a little bit of a whack. There we go. You can hear it crack loose. There is a spring and check ball underneath here. Make sure you don't lose those or they don't come flying out of there. They're not going to fly out, but they're going to try to roll out. Use your magnet again. Here's your spring, which is slightly smaller and thinner wired than the spring up here, which will be important to know later. And then your check ball, which is the same size as the check ball on top. The check balls you can interchange, the springs you should not. There is also a sleeve, a steel sleeve in the case right there. Sometimes they come right out, sometimes they do not. You have to watch for it, especially during reassembly, and if you put this in a solvent tank, the sleeve has to be there. If it doesn't come out of the case, don't worry about it, you can just leave it in. If it comes out, just make sure you install it again when you put the case together. You can go in there with snap ring pliers and see if it'll come out. In this case, it doesn't want to come out. It's perfectly fine, just leave it in. The speedo assembly is retained with a little tab that you can't see because it's filthy. And it's the #1 leak on these transfer cases. Usually the O-ring out here leaks, and there's a 12mm bolt. So take the bolt off. Just a little shorty 12, and then you have a little tab. It's just a little keyed tab, and then the speedo. In this case, it slid right out. If it doesn't slide out readily, you can always take a flat blade screwdriver, find the spot where the little retainer was, and use that to gently pry this guy out. If it's stuck really bad, you can try to actually tap it from the outside to punch it into the case a little bit to crack it loose and then pry it out with a screwdriver, or wait until you get it in the solvent tank and cleaned up, and that'll soften it up and then it should pull out. The speedo assembly uses an O-ring here to seal it from the case, and then there's also a seal on the inside here. Most people don't even know the seal is there. It's a very, very common leak. So to get to it, there's what we call a G-clip right here that wraps around this aluminum housing. You just push on both ends, make sure it doesn't go flying. It actually looks like a G, and you can see where that clip retains a speedo gear. Then the gear just pulls out, and you can see that there's a groove in the speedo gear for that clip to retain. To remove the small seal that's in the speedo bullet, we put the bullet in the vise with aluminum jaws. If you don't have aluminum jaws, wrap a rag around this guy and then put it in the vise. You don't want to gall or mar or scratch the surface, because then either it won't slide into the transfer case or it's going to cause a leak.
This is showing the seal that you're removing. You can see it right there. I've got a little tool pointing right to it.
We've had to deal with these seals many times. Sometimes they're really stuck, sometimes they come out easy. We found the easiest way to get them out is to put the bullet in the vise and then use this hook style tool, and you'll go just pass the seal with it, pull a little bit. If it comes out, great. If not, rotate a little bit, pull again, rotate again, pull again, and keep working it, and it should pop out. Sometimes they come right out, sometimes they fight. In this case, came right out. And this is what the seal looks like. It's just a little rubber sleeve like that. The last thing we need to do for the speedo bullet is to remove this O-ring. Sometimes they come right off, sometimes they're old and brittle or hardened. Has to be replaced. Again, there's a most common leak on these transfer cases, so try to get underneath it with a pick and get it out of there without stabbing yourself, hopefully. There you go. This one is so old that it cracked and broke. Typically these are very flexible. This one, 20-something years old, can't do its job anymore. And I wipe these guys down, and then once all the little parts are removed, then it's ready for the solvent tank. I always take things all the way apart before I put them in a solvent tank. Otherwise, you're still going to have oil or contaminants trapped underneath. The next items we're going to address is the breather fitting and line, and then the shift lever for high, neutral, and low. So the breather, pretty easy. Come in here with some needle nose pliers, get it under this clip, if we can get in there. There we go. Take that line off, and then I like to remove this fitting. It's just pressed in there. It goes back in readily enough with a little bit of silicone. I like to take these off to be able to get into the case better once we split the case halves, to clean the surface really, really well. All you have to do is come in with a pry bar and gently pry on it. It comes right out. This shifter or shift lever on the transfer case uses a wedge bolt that's just a pin on one side with a flat spot ground into it that's tightened by this nut, and it wedges that flat spot against what we call a hockey stick. 12mm socket. They're usually in there pretty good. Again, this is a wedge type thing, so it's had pressure on it for the last 25 years, and to get a little bit of rust on them, and then they stick in there. So what I do is I unscrew the nut part way and then use a drift. That way the nut retains the drift for me.
Oh, so the drift doesn't glance off.
Exactly, so the drift doesn't glance off, you don't smash the end of the threads. Sometimes they're really stuck, sometimes they come out. It'll travel a little way and then stop. There we go. If it's really stuck, then deal with some of the other stuff on the transfer case first and spray a little bit of WD-40 or PB Blaster on here and in here and let it soak in. And then just tap on it every once in a while. It'll break loose eventually. We're gonna take this one out. You can now unscrew the nut, and there's a lock washer. And then the pin should come out. If not, you can just put the drift on there and gently tap it out. Now you can see what I mean by a wedge bolt. It's mostly round, but then it has a flat spot machined in it. And that flat spot corresponds with a flat spot on this hockey stick lever. I put the nut and washer back on here so they're not lost. Put that with the rest of your hardware. This lever sometimes comes off. Like in this case, you can just kind of rotate it a couple of times and break it loose. If the lever itself doesn't want to come off the hockey stick, then grab a wire brush and clean some of the rust off. It's a pretty precise fit. And then just spray a very small amount of PB Blaster on there. Rotate it some more and it should come off like that. There's no need to force this stuff. Comes off. And then if you look over here, you can see the flat spot where the wedge bolt goes. Then there's a flat washer that comes off.
Is that a site specific or no?
No, this one's not. It's just a regular flat washer. It's just used as a spacer so this lever doesn't rub on the case as it moves back and forth. Okay, the next step in disassembling a transfer case is to remove the rear extension housing, which also houses the viscous coupler. There's a series of 9 bolts. They're all 14 millimeters. One of them has a little bracket on it. Actually, there's a bracket on the case half that will come off next. So this one, just a series of bolts, but they are different lengths, which will be important when we go back together. Work your way all the way around, no particular order. Again, if you look at these bolts closely, you'll see some of that green residue. That's the factory Loctite I was talking about earlier on the little detemp plugs. So peel all those bolts out. And you'll notice that there are 2 lengths. There are 4 short bolts that go just from the rear extension housing into the rear case half. They can't be too long, otherwise they'd hit the gear set. And then you have 5 longer bolts that go through the rear extension housing, through the intermediate plate or rear case half, and then into the main case half. So these guys have to reach all the way through. And they're only on the outside, so there's no chance of them hitting the gears. The next step in removing the rear extension housing is you literally have to pry or knock it off the rear case half. These cases don't use gaskets from the factory. That's all this orange stuff you're seeing. It's what we call FIPG, which stands for Form in Place Gasket. It's really a fancy term for silicone. Toyota uses a specialized silicone, which was orange for about 30 years, and they just redesigned it and changed the makeup of it, and it's now pink. Some guys like it, some guys don't. I've grown to like it. It's actually easier to work with. But when you see this orange stuff, that doesn't mean that somebody was in there and Mickey Mouse it all together with heat resistance RTV. That is the factory sealer. Again, no gaskets. So these cases are pretty much glued together and machined perfectly. To get it apart, it doesn't just slide apart like a case with a gasket would. So you literally have to kind of use a drift and knock them apart. They do have this little lip right here cast into it that you can go on. Problem is, if the case is stuck really bad, it'll just break that lip off. So I like going on the boss for the switches because it's much sturdier and there's no way you're gonna break that off. If you break that off, you probably shouldn't work on transfer cases. You can see it starting to separate. At that point, you don't have to hit it anymore. Just come in with a screwdriver and don't smash a screwdriver in there. Just get it in by hand and just pry on it gently. It shouldn't take much pressure at all. No matter what you do, you're always going to have a little bit of oil left in these transfer cases. So when you tear it apart, just like in this case, you're going to have some oil come out of it. One thing we always try to do, and I encourage my customers to do, is if you know you're going to pull out a transmission or a transfer case or a differential, get set up the night before, put the vehicle on jack stands, do whatever you need to do, pull the drain plug, put a drain pan underneath, and just walk away overnight. And that'll drain the vast majority of the oil out. Instead of doing it last minute, then spending 5 minutes trying to drain the oil, let it do its job overnight. Rear extension housing can come off. I always set some rags on the bench, because once I remove these guys, I sit them on the bench and just let them drain some more while I'm working on the other components. This just slides out at this point. You see see all the oil. The oil in this case, kind of nasty. So whoever had this transfer case didn't service their transfer case very well. You should change the fluid in these. Factory says about 50,000 miles. If you go off-roading or go through water or you're in rough climates or a lot of exposure, then you probably want to service it more often. And not a horrible idea to check the fluid levels in your diffs and transmission transfer case every time you change the engine oil. If the oil is dark like this, just drain it and refill it. Takes a couple minutes, doesn't cost very much. One thing you have to do once you pull this rear extension housing off is you see this little part sticking out here. That is actually the drive for the oil pump in this transfer case. Yes, these cases have an oil pump in them. It's a very, very simple pump. It's just a little rotor setup, and this is the drive key for it. It just slides out. It's almost like a little hex key. Don't lose that. If you don't have that in there, the pump's not going to work. The transfer case should survive, but if it ever runs low on fluid, it definitely won't survive. And it's important to have proper oil flow. We're going to show you later that some of these shafts actually have oiling passages in them with holes along the shaft to make sure that there's oil flow through the bearings and gears, so the oil's just not slinging around. And then if there's any contaminants in there, by having oil flow, it flushes those out and they get trapped on the magnets on the drain and fill plug. So take this and gently sit it upside down. You don't want to bend this tube or smash the end in. This has to stay in good shape. So I just put them on a rag like that, let it drain while we're tearing the rest of the case apart. Next thing we're going to do is remove this rear cover plate. It's held on by 5 bolts, also 14 millimeter. This sets the preload on the output assembly. The output gear cluster here is supported by a couple of tapered bearings, and just like any other tapered bearing, like in a wheel hub or a differential, it relies on the proper amount of preload for the bearings to last and the gears not to come out of mesh. Same on the counter shaft in here. It's also on a set of tapered bearings, which means you have some shims in there. You can see the shims fairly easily, and sometimes they fall off when you take the transfer case apart, but put a magnet on here. This one has a thick and a thin shim, and these are selectable. Toyota has them in probably 20 different thicknesses. We keep them in stock. When you rebuild a transfer case, or if you're just replacing the gears, typically you would start with the same shims, check your height and your preload, and then go from there. Most of the time when you build these transfer cases, the shims do not need to be changed out or replaced with other shims or substituted. But to keep it simple, and for the purpose of shooting this video, we're going to lay these components out. So the center assembly and bearings are going to be in one section. The output cluster is going to be in another section. When I tear them apart, I rip them apart and they go in a solvent tank. I've done hundreds of them, so I know where everything goes. But to make this a little simpler for somebody who's never done it, we're going to keep these components separated. Another reason why I like setting things on rags, first of all, it absorbs the oil. It keeps things from rolling off the bench. And by placing everything from one particular assembly on one rag, it stays together as a group. So we're going to take this rear plate off. Again, 14s. 5 bolts. The plate. These plates never wear. On some other applications, you'll find that the bearings sometimes walk around or spin and create a groove. On these guys, the plate is pressing against a shim. So these never go bad and never need to be replaced. Just like on the idler gear assembly, there are shims here. These are much bigger in diameter because the bearings are bigger diameter. Sometimes they pop out. There you go. And again, there's a thick and a thin shim in there. Sometimes it's just a thin shim, sometimes a thick shim, sometimes a combination. There's no general rule of thumb. It really depends on each case. Again, since these are machine surfaces, during the machining process, there are slightly different tolerances, hence different shimming required. Then the next step is, we have a little filter assembly or a pickup screen really for the oil pump here. There are 2 10 millimeter bolts that hold it on. I'm gonna pop those out. And it just slides right off. A lot of times it has some oil trapped in it. And I like to look on here and see what's there. A little bit of metal buildup here, not terrible. And there wasn't a whole lot on the magnet. I like to wipe my parts down and inspect them before I put them in the solvent tank. So I know right away if I have damage anywhere or if one of the bolts is messed up or anything along those lines. So I generally speaking wipe things down and look at them before they go through the cleaning process. A couple of minutes ago, we were talking about oil flow and the oil pump and everything else. If you look at this rear retainer plate for the rear bearing, you'll notice that it has a little cutout here. That cutout matches with a cutout in the rear case half and a window up here. So as the case is going down the road and the gears are turning, it sloshes oil up here, gets funneled in here, and then slowly works its way through here and creates oil flow through this bearing. Similar to the oil pump, there is a way to direct oil flow, kind of passive oil flow, and this is part of it. The next part of the teardown process is we need to remove this rear cover. Again, 5 14mm bolts. Let's buzz them off, they're kind of short. These are actually the shortest bolts in the transfer case. You'll see me modulate the trigger on the impact gun. I like to pull the bolt out and unthread the bolt slowly instead of just pulling the trigger and hoping for the best. That way, if a bolt jams up, hopefully I stop it in time before it snaps off or I have bigger issues. These bolts we can set aside. If you look at this plate closely, one of the 5 bosses for the bolt holes has a little ear on it. You can use that ear with a drift to knock the plate off. There will be a little bit of oil coming out of there, not much, but just tap on it gently. Again, silicone on. Pops right off. The reason you don't smack it sideways is it has these little retainers built in. Those go around here, and then the surface holds the bearing in place. If you hit the plate sideways, you're gonna knock these off, and then the bearing might be able to walk. So just be gentle, knock it off properly. Also, again, if you look at this, the coloration, you can tell that the oil in this was pretty old and dark. Should have been changed more often. At this point, the next step really is to remove the rear transfer case half. We've exposed the input assembly and the rear bearing that supports it. And if you look closely, you can see that there's a snap ring goes all the way around, and the opening in the snap ring is at the top here. So you can push back on the input gear. So I'm literally pushing on the front of the case and pushing the input gear back. You don't necessarily have to push it all the way out, but it makes it easier to remove this snap ring. That snap ring has to come off or you cannot get the case apart. Again, lay your parts out according to each assembly. There are a number of snap rings in the case. If you're not organized about it, and just chuck them all in the solvent tank, if you haven't built one of these cases before, it's gonna make your life more difficult trying to figure out where each snap ring goes and other components. So go per assembly. Here's our snap ring. So this doesn't have to go back in. It can actually makes your life easier if you have the bearing back in here to remove the case half. Look closely, you'll see that there's another series of bolts, again 14s, going around that hold the case half to the main case. And then there are none on the outside here because those were the 5 longer bolts that went all the way through the rear extension housing. So we just need to pull these bolts out. I also like to remove the drain and fill plug before everything goes through the wash. Again, I don't want any oil or contamination caught anywhere in the case, so I pull the plugs out of it. Jesus, what kind of animal was working on this? And one more. The bottom one has a little metal retainer on it. It goes on like so. This actually holds the wiring for the speed sensor or the speedo in place. It goes underneath the case, protects it from hanging down too low and possibly getting caught. It goes right down here. You can see the imprint where it's clean is where this little retainer goes. That'll be important to know for later. At this point, we're ready to separate the rear case half from the main case. Again, they have to be pried apart because they're silicone together. Here you can see the remnants of the silicone from the other components we've removed. Same thing happens here. In this case, again, you need to knock them apart. So you can either come in with a drift and go in here, or you can go between these two. See it's starting to split? At that point, wiggle it a little bit. It's a good idea to go up here because it's not really an essential mating surface, and pry there. In case you gouge the case a little bit, it won't hurt anything. And again, they separate very easily. If it's fighting you, double check, make sure you don't have a bolt in there or a retainer or something else keeping the case together. You can see the oil coming out of it. Even though we let this case drain, there's always a little bit of oil caught in there. So be ready for it, have some rags ready. So the case half should just wiggle off. Push on the input gear to keep it in place with your thumb and pull with your fingers. And it just slides off. And sit that down. Earlier we were talking about shims and tapered bearings. If you look at the idler assembly now, you can see the tapered bearing, and on the output you can see the tapered bearing. The races for them are in this rear extension housing, or the rear case half, and they're not a press fit. This is a floating fit, so if you put shims in there, they can actually move. If you watch this closely, I can push this through by hand, or I can at least move it. and slides through. They're supposed to be that loose. It's the only bearings in the case that you can move that readily, and they pop out. If they were press fit and you put shims on there, it'd be really hard to tell if it actually moves or how much preload it has on it. So they have to be able to basically float in those passages.
So it's just like a wheel bearing.
Exactly. Timken is a company that actually designed tapered bearings like this. One thing with the 80 series transfer cases is that it is really uncommon that we have one with bad bearings. The bearings are massive, the gears are massive, as you've seen. So generally speaking, very uncommon that they need a rebuild. A lot of times, especially if it's working right and not making any noise and the fluid's not contaminated, if you think about re-gearing it, might not necessarily mean that you have to rebuild it. And you want to look at these races good and make sure there are no grooves worn in them and no pitting. These actually look really, really good. And chances are they have 200,000 miles on them, but there's nothing here that screams it needs a rebuild. Look on this one, it's got some slight marks where you can see the bearings where each individual roller sat. That is somewhat questionable. In emergency, you can run that. In this case, we're putting all new bearings in and we're gonna replace them all anyways. Okay, the next step is to pull this gear cluster out. It's pretty heavy and you have to remove both gear sets at the same time along with this double shift fork setup. The little shift lever can come out, or you can just have it this way loosely. It'll straighten out so it won't hold you up. I like sitting things like this, again, either on a piece of cardboard or on a rag. A, because it's oily, and B, you don't want to just sit these gears on a table. They're really strong, but they also chip easily. So having a little bit of cushion is a pretty good idea. So just grab them 2 hands and just pull. This weighs probably 20 pounds, maybe a little more. So be ready for it. If you look at this assembly, it shows how different the 80 series case is than any of its predecessors. The gear cluster is not super different. The fact that we can select on the idler gear if we want high range or low range, and it not just being a one-piece design, is definitely a departure from the previous cases. The bearings are much bigger, the gears are huge, and this double fork design. So it actually shifts both clusters at the same time. First time I tell you to use that in a transfer case. To split these apart, I usually hold on to them just so they don't flop around on the bench, and just rotate this fork up, and then you can let both come to a rest, and then the fork pulls out. You can see there are fork pads on here. The smaller section goes on the idler, smaller gears, smaller bearings, so it slides in here. The larger section goes on the slider in the output assembly. Again, larger gears, larger bearings, and larger fork portion. The next thing we're going to take out is a little shift lever. It just slides down, especially since we wire wheeled it. If this has a bunch of rust on there, it doesn't want to slide out, then leave it up, use a little bit of sandpaper or Scotch-Brite or a wire brush and knock the rust off so you don't damage the board that it goes through. It's just a portion of the case that's been machined. It's just aluminum. There's no steel sleeve or anything in there. So pull that guy out, make sure it's in decent shape, and then take the little shift lever seal out. Easiest way to do that, you don't even have to use a hook. You can use a small wrench. You can use a screwdriver. Just come underneath it and just pry gently, and it pops right up. This seal is part of the rebuild kit. It's not going to be reused. Going back to this fork one more time, you can see the casting right here has a notch in it. That's where the shift lever goes. So when you're shifting it, you're pushing it forward or back and moving the fork back and forth, actuating these sliders. You can also see these cutouts here. If you envision this fork being in the case, ends up in here, that's where our detent ball and spring was. So detent here, here, and here. High, neutral, low. Back to finishing the teardown. Next thing is to take the input gear assembly out of there, input cluster. The front of it sticks out of the case a little bit. You can see it right here, this sleeve, and there's a seal. Just put your hand on here, put your other hand here, gently push on it, and it should slide out. This is where the seal rides. This is the portion you saw that sticks out. These are the splines where it couples to the transmission and is driven that way. On this alone, we have a total of 3 snap rings. We had one on the rear that we took out already. Then there's one here that retains a bearing to the shaft. And then there's another one here that retains a gear to the shaft. We'll take these apart later. But again, we're gonna sit this on a rag with the snap wing we already removed from that assembly earlier. To get a little more technical about these input shafts, on the 80 series, the shaft was a spline shaft and the gear has female splines on the inside, and the bearing gets pressed on and retained with a snap ring. The gear is also retained with a snap ring. On the 100 series transfer cases, the shaft and gear is all one part. There are no splines here, so the gear cannot be removed from the shaft. So in a 100 series, if you plan on changing the high range or low range, you actually have to change the input shaft to an 80 series input shaft if you want to change the gear ratio for your high range, either to an overdrive or underdrive. Okay, the last portion of tearing the transfer case apart, or at least splitting the main components, is to remove the front output housing. At this point, I like to stand the case up on end on a rag on the bench so it can drain a little bit. And there's a series of 6 bolts that need to come out, fairly evenly spaced. The top right bolt has a retainer that holds the wiring harness out of the way from the front drive shaft. So make sure you put that back in place. Another thing you'll notice on this transfer case, or this style transfer case, and it really started with the HF2A in 1991 and then continued from there on the Land Cruisers, is that the output flanges don't have a nut that retains them. The shaft is literally all one piece, so they're internally retained with a series of snap rings. Makes them very different than any other transfer case. The first time you work on one, people look at it and go, oh wow, I can't take the flange off. They're all retained internally, which really makes them different than any other previous case and a little more complicated. Again, be organized about it because there are so many snap rings. You'll see them in a minute. We can also remove the front input seal at this point. When you knock these out, you can come from the inside and go inside the seal and push them out, or you can come from the outside. Don't go between the case and the seal, or you're going to create a gouge and it's going to leak. So move a little inboard, or safer yet, go from the inside. If you look in here, you can see the seal. There's an outside lip of the seal and the inside lip. Go between the two and just tap on it. And it pops right out. That way you can see where the screwdriver pressed on the seal and there's no damage on the outside or in the seal bore in the case. So we're not gonna have a problem with any leakage. To remove the front extension housing, you could tap on this and possibly break it off. You can tap in here with a drift like that, or you can actually tap this shaft with a dead blow hammer. It won't hurt it. Pops right out. Take this guy, you can stand it up for a sec so you can look at it. At this point, you can remove one of the shift forks. If you look closely at this fork, it has these little ribs. If you look back to the beginning videos, if you can remember, we had a gear that went through the case. That gear actually comes in here and then moves this rail back and forth. By the gear turning, either pulls the rail back or pushes it forward. And that is what engages the front output solidly to the gear cluster onto this hub. So it goes from all-wheel drive to four-wheel drive or center diff lock. You can see it's a spline section. Always rides in here. Then when it's moved upwards, it couples together with the splines on the gear cluster. You also want to take a close look at this, since this is going to go in the solvent tank. The top of this is rounded off and fairly smooth and just cast. The bottom is machined perfectly flat. And if you look closer, you'll see that the gears here, or the splines, are just a perfectly straight cut. The mating side is chamfered and tapered because it always lives in that hub, and then when it slides up, it needs to be able to slide into place. If it was a straight cut, it'd be really hard to get them to line up. By being tapered like that, if they have to rotate a little bit, the splines will rotate and then align. So this section, the tapered, has to go towards the mating splines. So we've shot a number of videos like this and taught people how to work on transfer cases and transmissions and differentials. And when we do, I try to use the least amount of specialty tools possible just to simplify the job and show people that they can do the job with fairly simple tools, or tools they can make themselves or buy cheaply versus buying expensive specialty pullers and things of that nature. The next tool is a classic example of that. This is a $20 seal puller and race remover. And it's really designed so you can go into a bore, hook it in, then pull it out with one hand and smack it with a hammer. That's why this is here. In this case, we use it as a lever, this little hook, because we have in the main transfer case half, we have what's called a bearing pocket, so we cannot drive this bearing through from the far side. So you have to find a way to pull this. There's a specialty puller that basically comes in with two jaws, grabs underneath here, and then pulls it out. If you don't want to spend the money on that, then you use one of these. And if you look really close, there is a relief here, and there's one on the other side. We'll see them better once I pull this out. That is designed so you can get a puller in there. Otherwise, there's no lip on the bearing to grab. So what I do, I take this tool, we actually ground it down a little bit to make it a little shallower so we can get in there. Come in here, and just gently pry on it a little bit. And you can see the bearing lifting. Again, don't force it. Sometimes they only go a little bit, then go on this side, go on the opposite side, pry it a little more, right? Keep working your way back and forth. If it doesn't want to come all the way out, I use a little spacer and I use the same tool. In this case, it's an old pilot bearing. It happened to be just the right height. Sit that in there, use that as a block, and pop it up. You can use, some kind of spacer. You can use a bolt you cut into pieces, whatever. A steel plate, anything will work. And then it pulls it out. I like to wipe my parts down and look at them, to inspect them, to see if there's any damage before I throw things away or go through the parts wash. If you look closely, hard to see, but there are some mild grooves here, or you can see where each roller bearing sat and has worn a little bit of a spot into the race. In this case, I would recommend rebuilding the case instead of just putting it back together with the old bearings. And if you look in here, you can see the two cutouts I was talking about. There's one here and then one on the opposite side. So you can get puller jaws in there, or this little puller slides in here, pries the bearing out. The other bearing for the main cluster, you can get to from the other side. Again, there are two cutouts. There's one here and one here. You can use a punch or some kind of drift. We have these specialty bearing drifts. Tap a little bit on one side and on the other side, and work your way back and forth. Bearing comes out, wipe it down. Same thing here. Just slightly discolored, not as shiny as it should be, and you can see some really, really mild, not even indentations. It's just a line you can see that's formed. So these bearings are pretty much at the end of their life.
Now you call that a bearing, it's not a race?
It's a bearing race, really. Right.
Okay.
Absolutely, you're right. Now we have this case half pretty much torn completely apart. You can see the remnants of the factory orange silicone all the way around. You can see a lot of nasty oil. See silicone here. The seal's been removed. The bearing's been removed. This other bearing is out. Our shift lever is out. The shift lever seal is out. The only item left to remove is this little tin shield. This is for passive oil flow. As the gears turn, they splash oil up here. It gets caught in this funnel and then redirected in here through the front and then washes through the bearing and makes sure that nothing gets trapped in the bearing. And any particles that might be in there get flushed out, and there's oil flow to keep the bearing cool. Since that bearing, especially that bearing, is not submerged in the oil. You can kind of see an oil line in here. Goes from here across to here. That is where the oil typically sits when the vehicle's sitting still. The cluster is mostly submerged. The idler assembly is partially submerged, but the input assembly is sitting in the air, so it relies on oil being splashed up to it. The oil pump does not transport oil up to that. It only deals with the output cluster. So to get this guy out, 12 millimeter bolt, a shorty bolt. There's only one of them in the transfer case. And then here is a little oil funnel. Again, I like to wipe these down, and then I look to see if there's a clean spot somewhere, which means it's been rubbing on something. If it looks fairly uniform and it's not bent, then it's fine to reuse it. These never give any trouble, but it's worth mentioning. Now that we have the transfer case pretty much split apart, we're going to finish tearing down the sub-assemblies. You can start with any of them, doesn't really matter. Obviously, the main case half is done. The rear case half is pretty much done. So I'm going to focus on the extension housings next, and then the gear sets. I typically start with the rear extension housing. You can do it in any which way you want. The one thing to keep in mind on these extension housings, since these shafts are one piece, so it's basically all one piece from here to here, these little studs for the drive shaft flange are pressed in place. So if you drop this hard enough, it's gonna knock this guy out and press it part way out. And they're kind of a bear to get back in there. So don't drop the case half. Don't just sit it down really harsh on the bench. You'll see later how we deal with it during assembly. But when you move these around, be gentle with these guys. If you have to, or if you're concerned about it, you can always stack a few nuts washers on here and then put the factory nut on there to keep it from being able to push down. But when you're working with them, just sit them on the bench gently. Earlier, when we took this guy apart, we mentioned that this is your viscous coupler, and then your oil pump is in here. The oil pump is retained by 3 Torx bolts. The flatheads, they love to strip out. They've been in there for 20-something years. They're Loctited from the factory. If you don't have the right bit, you're gonna strip them. And I would highly recommend taking this apart to get rid of all the old nasty oil. It's a T30 Torx bit. To crack these guys loose, I found that it's a really good idea to put the bit in there and then tap it with a hammer to shock them and help break them loose. Again, I'm supporting this with my hand because I'm not trying to transfer the stress and shock to these studs. I'm just trying to crack this loose. You can also do it by having it laying on the bench if you're worried about it.
Do you ever use an impact driver to get those up?
I have, yeah. And realistically, you can do them with a ratchet. It's actually easier if you use a small electric impact gun. Obviously, there are tons of different brands of electric impact guns out there. I've had the DeWalt stuff forever. The tools I use for tear down, when I do the more finer and smaller bolts, I don't like using something super torquey. So I actually prefer these because they don't have enough power to snap bolts. So in this case, I already tapped on the bolt to help crack them loose. When you remove these, don't just put the gun on there and pull the trigger. Put a little bit of pressure on it so it can't back out and strip the bolt for you. Otherwise, you have to deal with bolt extraction. Just adds more time. So support from underneath, put a little pressure on there, and they come right out. Again, it's a fairly small bolt. If they look like they're damaged at all, we throw these in a scrap and we keep new ones in stock. Most of the time, I replace these. They're readily available from Toyota. We keep them in stock too. But if they're in good shape, there's no problem with reusing them. This is the oil pump cover plate. Sometimes they slide right out, sometimes they don't. If you look close, there's a little bit of silicone trapped in here from when the case was assembled. So take a pick, gently get that out of there. Sometimes they fight a little bit. It's perfectly fine to leave it in there, let it go through the solvent tank, and then pull the components out, but at least try to get it out. Easiest way, put a pair of snap ring pliers in there and twist it. In this case, popped right out. They're not a press fit, they're just sitting in there. Again, it's a slide fit. It's quite a bit looser than the bearing races we talked about earlier. Again, I wipe these guys down and I make sure that where that little rotor goes, a little geo rotor, that we don't have excessive wear. You can see a little bit of a mark, perfectly acceptable. Then you take your snap ring pliers again. That's your little rotor. And if you look close, you see a little arrow on there. You also see an arrow here. When you go back together, you have to see both those arrows pointing upwards. You don't want to install it this way. You can see the little hex drive from the drive gear we talked about earlier. And there's a recess in the bottom of the case here that this sits in to keep it concentric. You can see the little arrow here. This one's easy enough to put in there upside down, but you want to go back in the way it came out. Again, I like to wipe these guys off a little bit and look at them, make sure there's no galling, that nothing went through there, no metal particles that did any damage. And it turned pretty freely when we had the little drive gear in there during assembly. I always check that to make sure it turns nicely. If it doesn't, we know we have a problem. Okay, the next step is to get the viscous coupler out. There's not a lot of clearance in here, and there's a snap ring down in there. You can see the opening between here and here. It's a fairly small snap ring. Can be a little bit of a bear to get out of there. I use two different types of snap ring pliers for working on these cases. I have the angled jaws for the snap rings like we did on the input assembly, where you have a big snap ring like that and you have to go into a groove to pop it open. And then I use a different type of snap ring plier to get some of the other snap rings out that you can't necessarily get to with these guys. In this case, on the viscous coupler, we don't have room for this much width, but we have enough room for this guy. So you have to use this type of snap ring plier. Obviously, there are dozens of different types out there. This is one of the more challenging snap rings. So sometimes I use a magnet on the opposite side of the opening, come in there, pry it open, and then try to lift it out. They can fight you a little bit. Okay, sometimes it takes a couple of attempts. You finally get this guy. Keep that with the rest of the parts for the rear extension housing. Okay, now that we have that snap ring out, finally, and that one, like I said, can and will fight you a little bit. You can grab, there's a groove around the viscous coupler. These things weigh probably 5 pounds. Get your fingers in there, pull up on it, and put it on the bench. It's almost a solid chunk of steel.
So viscous, so it has the gear oil traveling throughout this on the inside?
Right. There's fluid in there, and that creates a dampener / coupler. And you can see the splines for the viscous coupler is the second set of splines here, down here, and that is a snap ring groove from the snap ring we just removed. The splines at the end of the shaft here go into the output cluster and go into the back portion of the center diff, which we'll tear apart later so I can show you how that works. We still need to finish tearing this guy apart. There's now an oil splash guard in here that's completely unessential. If for some reason yours is rusted or damaged or whatever, you can leave it out, doesn't matter. But it is retained, and this is part of the oil pump assembly. So the oil Pressure gets generated in here. It gets picked up on that little screen we removed earlier, then gets sent in here with a little steel tube. Oil pressure is generated here. It's not a whole lot. It comes down through here. You can see kind of the casting here. It goes through here, then through this guy. There's a little tiny vent hole here. So some oil comes out here, and then it goes around this shaft and then gets forced through this shaft. We'll tear it apart so I can show you that in more detail. Next part of the teardown is we need to remove that splash guard and this aluminum housing that I guess controls the oil flow to the shaft. So 10mm bolt. You can use a little electric impact on it, but it's such a little bolt that I'd rather do them by hand. Again, if you break one of those off, you're in trouble. So just be gentle with them. Use your trusty magnet again. And I put these, again, with the rest of the parts for the rear extension housing. An oil slinger. And the way you think about it, the way it bolts back in is it covers the drain plug area. Drain plug's down here. You can see where all the nasty oil was and where the oil line was. So this goes towards the bottom of the transfer case. We'll wipe that down later so we can continue with the tear down. So now we have this plate in here that actually needs to be removed. There are two styles of this plate. They look identical, but on some of them, including this one, the holes that these bolts went through, the little 10mm bolts, if you look really closely, these bolt holes are threaded. On some of the early cases, they are not threaded. And then it's kind of a bear to get this plate out because there's some oil sealing rings in here that ride fairly snugly on this shaft. And it's a fairly tight slip fit for this aluminum plate to go into the housing. So Toyota finally figured out that they were kind of a bastard to remove. So they threaded these holes. And what you do to remove it is you take the plate and it should spin. You might have to tap it. You spin it a little bit until you're away from the holes that the bolts thread into. Then you use a set of 8x125 bolts, about the most common thread on any Toyota out there. And these bolts thread into the plate now. I use a magnet to lower them down in there and get them started. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. So thread those in. And you basically threading the bolts in. The bolt will go down further and further until it stops. And then if you thread it in more, it's going to force that plate up as the bolt spins.
It's like taking a drum break off with an 8x1.25.
Exactly.
Or rotor.
So this bolt didn't want to go in smoothly, so I'm going to find another one. And don't force it. As soon as this thing snugs down a little bit, go to the next bolt hole. So I'm going to grab one more bolt really quick.
So you just tighten those 3 M8 bolts down equally, and it draws that plate off.
Exactly. You want to watch and the distance, and you can see how it's pulling it up in relation to the outside. And just gentle. I'm grabbing my ratchet at the center, so I have no torque at all, basically, instead of just jamming those bolts down in there.
You want to draw it off equally and slowly.
Correct. Yep. Just work your way around. Again, be patient. If you strip one of these out or break one off, you're going to spend a couple hours trying to fix your mistake. So a little bit of patience goes a long ways.
About how long are those M8 bolts?
The threads on them need to be 3/4 of an inch to maybe an inch at the most. The plate needs to come up about a 1/2 inch.
Okay.
So the thickness of the plate's about a 1/4 inch, so you really want something about 3/4 of an inch long. It just popped loose, but we'll just double check. Now you should be able to take a pick. There's one hole in here and pull up on the plate. And then you come in and grab the bolts and just wiggle the plate and see if you can bring it up. Again, be patient. There's a set of sealing rings in there that can break. And with nice oil and clean oil, typically we don't see these issues. With old oil, these plates love to stick in here. It's obviously hard to reach in there unless you have little itty bitty hands. This one's being fairly stubborn, but we'll get it out. Sometimes I use that same seal puller and I'll gently tap, get it down in the hole, tap it up a little bit. But if you can't spin this plate on the shaft, it means it's wedgy. Then you have to get it back down in position where you can spin it. And this plate absolutely has to come off to get to the last bearing and the seal that seals the shaft from the case. So just be gentle. Now it's going. There she goes. So, and it's just aluminum, so this is fairly soft. The sealing rings on the shaft, which I'll show you later, are fairly hard material. If you get this wedgie and put a gouge in here, then you have to replace this or your oil pump's not gonna work properly. Okay, we've cleaned the case up a little bit so it's easier to see. And you can see where we pressed this plate, the oil plate, out of the case with the screws. You can see there's a small indentation, just a little tiny mark from the screws. Not gonna hurt anything, perfectly fine. But you can also see, if you go back up here to the oil pump, oil pressure is created here. So this is incoming, gets pressurized here and then forced through here, down through this passage. There's a little hole here that corresponds with a hole in the plate here. Then the oil goes through here. There's a little tiny check hole here. And then the oil pretty much rides in here and in between these sealing rings. We'll see them later when we take the shaft out of here. So the oil's forced into the shaft via these sealing rings. Sealing rings are very, very common on automatic transmissions to direct pressure into a clutch pack or whatever. So the oil gets forced in here, and then if you look closely, there's a little tiny oiling hole here.
Oh, so that oil's the bearing.
There are oiling holes along the way that make sure that oil's directed in the right way. There's actually some in the front shaft too, and that's why this tube has to be there, because oil goes through here, in here, and then gets forced through a couple of holes in here also. So looking down in here, we can now see the splines that drove the rear half of the differential, or the center diff. These splines drive the viscous coupler, and then we have our next snap ring and the speedo gear. There's another set of splines in here that hold the speedo gear in place, so we need to pull that snap ring out. Here you can kind of see the snap ring there. I already have it part way out. There we go. Snap ring comes out. Wipe it off a little bit, make sure it's not damaged, and again, put that with the rest of the parts from the rear extension housing. The speedo gear was retained by that snap ring. I'm just gonna reach in there and it just pulls up. It is splined at the top side, which is important to remember. The rest of it just slides down on the shaft. So it just sits on there. The splines just keep it from spinning on the shaft.
And that's directional? Could you put that in upside down?
No, you'd never be able to get it all the way down in there, and then the snap ring wouldn't fit either. So the easiest thing to remember is that the snap ring goes by the splines. So drops down in, you'll see the splines, and then the snap ring goes on there.
Okay.
Again, sit this with the rest of the parts for the rear. Looking back down in there, you can see there is another snap ring. Right here is the opening. That snap ring retains this entire shaft to the bearing. You can see the opening for the snap ring here. And it's the third and biggest snap ring so far on that rear case half. Sit it with all the air stuff. As you can tell, like I promised earlier, there will be a collection of snap rings in these. Now we need to remove this shaft from the housing. It's a mild press fit into the bearing. We have a special fixture we use, but again, shooting these videos and trying to help people understand these cases and learn how to build them, I always try to keep it as simple as possible and show different techniques on how to do things. So we're gonna do this as simple as possible without any specialty tools, just to show you how you can do it without damaging the case. The simplest way to get this shaft out of there, you cannot tap on this. This has to stay intact, cannot be damaged, bent, scratched, removed, has to stay in place. So you can use a fairly good sized socket, but you have to be careful again that these guys don't get smacked or whatever. So easiest way to do it, I put a rag over it so I don't get dirty. I put another rag on the bench like this, and I put one hand under the case to catch the shaft. If that shaft hits your toes or the ground, something's gonna get damaged. And you can see I put it underneath the oil pump here. You're not gonna damage the case. You just tap on this. You can hear the sound changing. That means it's moving. There you go. You don't have to have a press. You don't have to have any specialty tools. You just have to do it with a thought in mind. You don't want that shaft shooting out of there and hitting the ground and then punching these studs through or damaging the shaft itself or the little oiler sleeve. And now, wipe this down a little bit. We can see the two sealing rings I was talking about in the oil passage. If you look really close, there's an interlock here. So the sealing rings themselves are like a little double hook design. So one's got a hook this way and one's got a hook this way, and that's how it locks together. This is actually like a split ring, and they can be replaced. Again, very, very common on automatic transmissions. They're the same part, and they both have this little hook junction. And when this oil plate goes down on there, you can see there's a smooth surface here or a polished surface here, and on this side. That's where the sealing rings ride. It's almost like a piston ring. When this slides down on there, those sealing rings literally compress a little bit, and that's how they seal and keep oil pressure in there. They're pretty strong and they last a long time. They're very hard, but if you just take this and hammer down on there, you're gonna snap one of these rings and then you're gonna replace the oil plate and both sealing rings. We do keep them in stock because it has happened. At this point, we have the rear extension housing completely torn apart, and this shaft is pretty much a one-piece unit. Other than these sealing rings and this oil slinger can be removed, the studs can be removed and pressed out also. So if you have a stud with damaged threads, then you have to pry this oil slinger off and press new studs in here. Generally speaking, they hold up pretty well. 3 more components that need to come out of the rear extension housing. One of them is this bearing, again, retained by a snap ring. You can see the opening for the snap ring all the way down here. And we'll use a pair of screwdrivers. I'll show you how to do that in a second. And on the other side, we have the seal. Going back to the basic design of this transfer case, since this shaft is all one piece and the flange doesn't come off, if that seal ever leaks, you have to remove this extension housing from the transfer case and then go through this entire process to get to that seal. Not a lot of fun. If we take one of these transfer cases apart to re-gear or fix anything else, if they're already out of the car, a lot of times we go through the extra trouble and time and expense to replace these seals. The last thing you want to do is run these seals again if they're already 25 years old and have 200,000 miles on them, only to have a problem a couple months later down the road. Luckily, Toyota did a really good job on designing these dirt shields and slingers. These guys kind of interlock. So when you look at this seal, even though the case is dirty, the seal itself has no dirt around it anywhere. Because as the shaft turns, it forces dirt and grease and grime and oil or any contaminants away from the seal and protects the seal. The easiest way to remove external snap rings like this is with 2 screwdrivers. I will typically use a fairly good sized one and a medium sized one. So I use the big screwdriver to pry the snap ring away from the case. I get the small screwdriver between the case and the snap ring. Then I come back in with the big one. I'm gonna twist it to get the snap ring lifted up. At that point, I stop prying. Then I grab a rag, come down in, I grab the end of the snap ring with the rag, and I twist the snap ring to try to pretty much tighten the snap ring up. I twist and pull. And it comes right out. You don't have to fight it. It doesn't go flying. You're not gonna damage it. Snap ring's out. And now, with 4 snap rings just for the rear extension housing.
It's kind of interesting. As you took them off, they went from small to larger.
Right. And the problem is, the same thing happens on the front and on some of the gear clusters. So you want to keep them separate because there's so many different size snap rings that it's much easier just to lay them out and take your time. So now we can remove the bearing that's down in there and the seal that's up here. The bearing, you can use a drift. Again, we have these special bearing seal race drivers. Tap a little bit on each side. They're a mild press fit. They're not super tight, so it slides out fairly readily. Again, it's a really good idea to keep that with the rest of the parts for the rear extension housing. Then same thing we did on the other seal. Lay that down, take a screwdriver, go into the seal right there and just tap on it. There you go. Seal comes out. Put your seal with the rest of your parts. Wipe this guy out. Make sure we didn't scratch it anywhere, which in theory we can't, the way we knocked the seal out. And then this is ready to go through the wash. It's completely torn down, oil pumps out, plates out, shafts out, switches are out. Only thing left in there that we took apart earlier is our sleeve for the oil pump. If you're worried about it and are worried that it might fall out in the solvent tank or parts washer, you can try to knock it out of there. Easiest thing to do is just take this and gently tap the case on the bench on a rag. Sometimes they walk out, sometimes they don't. I'm not gonna hit it any harder than that. That one's in there to stay. Perfectly fine. Sit that aside, let the oil drain out of it, move on to the next portion of the teardown.
Since the disassembly is taking quite a long time to document, we're gonna break right here, go grab a beer, go grab a cup of coffee, whatever floats your boat, and come back with us in part 2 where we finish the disassembly of this transfer case.